Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here for this session at the SDG Showcase. My name is Ben Newell. I am the Director of the Institute for Climate Risk and Response here at UNSW, and I'm also a Professor in the School of Psychology at UNSW. And I was asked to put together a session today for this showcase on advancing opportunities in climate risk and response, and give a bit of an overview, an idea about what the Institute for Climate Risk and Response is, what we do. And so I'm going to do that over a few slides and talk a little bit about what I do as well. And then I'm going to bring up three panelists who have all been working with us at the Institute in various different ways, or have been benefiting from interacting with the Institute. And I'm going to explain how that worked, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion, and then we'll have time for Q&A if there is any Q&A. So I'm going to start off by giving you a bit of background into the UNSW Institute for Climate Risk and Response. There's a QR code there if you want to scan it and find out more about us, then please do. The Institute was established a couple of years ago, and it's a kind of university initiative that sits across three different faculties here at UNSW. So Faculty of Science, Faculty of Business, and the Faculty of Law and Justice. And we were brought together in sort of recognition of the need for there to be a focal point for the climate science, the physical climate science that was being done here at UNSW, and there was lots of people who are very strong in physical climate science, how that could be connected more with other parts of the university who are working on these topics, who are trying to drive a kind of climate action agenda, and to use that science and that understanding to inform other research and other strategies across the university, all under this broad banner of climate risk and response. So our mission, as we put forward at the start of launching the Institute, is up on the screen here: to drive fundamental research and development in climate risk and response. The Institute will provide expertise and information in ways that can feed directly into end users' current risk management frameworks, thereby allowing industry, government, and policymakers to undertake robust planning for the impacts of climate change. So one of the key things that we wanted to do in the Institute was to take the research outside of the traditional academic circles, the so-called kind of ivory tower sometimes, and engage directly with end users of this information. So in part, this was driven by changes in regulation that have been happening recently around climate disclosures. So now lots of companies, organisations, government are having to disclose, are having to officially report on the kinds of risks that are going to impact their operations as a result of climate change. And in order to do that, you need to have a good understanding of what are the physical risks, what are the impacts of severe weather that's going to affect your business, and also understand things like transition risks. So how does the change, the move towards a decarbonised society, how's that going to affect the way that you operate as a business or a government? And so we were really trying to build on these ideas of climate translation, of governance and assurance, and the behavioural science part, which is what I bring and the team that are in psychology bring, is that recognition that this is a human behaviour problem or a human behaviour issue. And we have to understand how to change human behaviour. We have to understand how people use this information to make decisions, how risk is perceived, how uncertainty is dealt with, in order to move the dial on a lot of these issues. So it's been a very busy couple of years in putting the Institute together, and I want to give you a few little kind of highlights of the kinds of things that we've been doing over the last 24 months or so. One of the things that we wanted to do, of course, is to drive research and to drive thought leadership in these areas, and so this is just a selection of articles, mostly from conversational press releases based on research that we've been doing. And you can see that it spans a very wide range of topics. So on the left here, there's an article about Tim Raupak, who's a physical climate scientist working with us, who does work on severe convective storms and hail. His position is actually part funded by QBE Insurance in an integrated sort of research partnership. Then we've got work looking at fossil fuel expansion, so that some of the work that Maria is going to talk about on the panel is directly related to this. How do we balance fossil fuel expansion with the impacts on not just our own, within our own boundaries of Australia, but outside that in the Pacific and beyond. What are the impacts of these kinds of projects going to be? We've also been doing work directly on the economic impacts of climate change. So Tim Neal, who is a senior lecturer in the School of Economics, has been working on some models that look at how you project out the impacts of climate change, the economic impacts of climate change over the next 40, 50, 60, 70 years, and demonstrating that a lot of the current techniques tend to underestimate those impacts quite severely, and changes in the assumptions that you build into the models changes those impacts quite fundamentally. We've also been working with the Faculty of Law and Justice on sort of governance and litigation type issues, as well as the expansion of fossil fuels. We've also got projects looking at greenwashing, and there's an article there by Riona Moodley, who's one of our scholars that is in the Faculty of Law, and she was writing a piece on what are all these claims about greenwashing, what's the difference between greenwashing and green hushing, how are people, changing their attitude towards communication around climate. So it's quite a broad church. We're covering quite a few different topics, and when we get to the panel, you'll hear more in detail about some of the sort of seed-funded projects that we have. Another key element of what we've been working on in collaboration with the International Universities Climate Alliance, that Chase here in the audience is representing, is a work towards the possibility of having COP31 in Australia. So COP is the Conference of the Parties. The UNFCCC is the UN body that is basically charged with coming up with a plan across 195 countries about what we do to reduce our emissions and address climate change. And Australia is in the bidding, still not decided, to host COP31 in conjunction with Pacific next year. And one of the initiatives we have been involved in at ICRR, along with several other universities in Australia and in the Pacific, is to develop this COP31 Universities Alliance to try and think about the events and set the sort of action agenda for a potential COP in Australia and the Pacific. And this is a document that I worked on with Wes Morgan, who is a international relations scholar who works with us in the institute with a lot of deep knowledge of the Pacific, used to work at the University of South Pacific, and he's been working on those projects with us in conjunction with people at Melbourne and also with DFAT and DQ in the government. So lots going on. Another key facet of the Institute when we launched it is to try and think about how we build in education about climate risk and response into the broader curriculum, both within the university but also externally. And with the shift towards more postgraduate learning, the lifelong learning parts of the Progress for All strategy, we're positioning ourselves at the Institute as being one of the kind of leaders for bringing together that interdisciplinary, postgraduate focused lifelong learning opportunities. So in particular, we've been developing courses that build on the expertise that we have in the Institute in terms of understanding the impacts of climate, the impacts for litigation, the impacts for disclosures. And we've got various different programs that we've been running over the last year or so. One is this one on Mastering Climate Risk for a Resilient Future, which is basically about upskilling people to be able to do the mandatory climate reporting for their organisations. So we've been running this as a small, kind of focused 30 or so people, mostly professionals, people that are either in the area or want to get into the area to build up their skills. Some of it is quite technical to understand actually how you do the necessary accounting, how you think about the emissions, how you actually plan that as part of your business. So we've got courses running on that. And we've also broadened it out a little bit into a special topic within the MBA program. So the MBA program is obviously run through the AGSM, but through the Institute, we've developed this MBA short course special topic on climate risk and response, and it's built out of different modules that reflect the skills that we have in the in the Institute. So we have a day that is focused directly on behavioural responses and communication around climate change. We have another day that's focused on economic and financial impacts that Kristle, who's another guest you'll meet in a minute, was very kind to help us out on. We also have one that's actually running tomorrow, which is looking at litigation and governance. And then we have one at the start that was more about climate science and the diplomatic sort of broader world position on how Australia sits in the world relative to its peers in terms of climate action. So all of these things, I think you'll get the sense that they're building towards a very interdisciplinary, integrative approach that builds on lots of the SDGs, right? The showcase here is about the SDGs. Clearly, the SDGs fit in with multiple different lines of the work that we're doing in the Institute. As well as the external sort of facing education, we also have on-campus seminars that are run monthly. They're both online and in person. And we invite people from around the university, but also externally, to come and present on, again, different topics that are related to the focus that we have. So in the picture here is one by Samantha Stanley, who is a ARC DECRA fellow working with us on, she's a social psychologist, and she's looking at kind of attitudes towards climate migration, climate refugees, and so on. We have one coming up next week, Professor Elizabeth Thurbon, who is an expert in sort of political economy. She's going to be talking about green energy statecraft for comprehensive national security. She has a big project on that work at the moment, funded by, I think, the Atlassian guys. So she'll be giving a talk on that next week, and that's in the Matthews building where we're physically located, which is another thing I think that's important about setting up ICRR, is that as well as being an institute that has a website and has a presence, we also have a physical location where we can all actually meet together and collaborate and share ideas. And we're lucky to have space co-hosted with the Climate Change Research Centre, who's been there for a long time in the Matthews building. And it means we have our office spaces with climate scientists sitting next to economists, sitting next to behavioural scientists, sitting next to legal scholars. And that creates that kind of discussion that I think is really important for driving some of these interdisciplinary projects. What's happened? There we go. I'll skip that one. We also run lots of events and lots of workshops. We were very fortunate last week to run this industry forum. It was a very successful event that we had in the Botanic Gardens in the Calyx last week that again brought in panelists from lots of different disciplines, lots of different backgrounds to have really, really good discussion along topics to do with economic impacts, food security, insurance affordability, as well as the sort of governance and the climate diplomacy issues as well. So it was a good event. It's the second time we've run it, and I think it's got better this year than it did last year. We also had an early career researchers workshop the day before. Again, this is the second time we've run that, and that's very much focused on PhD, postdocs, early career academics, again, working in these broad areas, but perhaps not with the network to talk to each other across these disciplinary boundaries, right? It's quite hard as a young scholar to get that interdisciplinary exposure. And so what the early career workshop was there to do was to bring people in from climate science, from economics, from cognitive science, to all talk with each other about the ways that they're addressing climate and climate risk. You don't have to just take it from me. This is a message that was inside the Vice-Chancellor's newsletter just today. He came and opened the conference for us last week, the industry forum last week. And I think this quote captures quite well what we're trying to do and how we're situated at the university. I'm conscious of time a little bit, so I'm going to jump to a little bit about my background, but then also I just want to give an example of how I've used the SDGs and SDG framework in my own teaching and education, and a way that I think builds some links for this kind of next generation of people coming through behavioural science, at least, to think about how to benefit from understanding what the SDGs can offer us. So these papers up here in books are just snapshot of some of the things that I do. So it might seem strange that I'm someone that's in psychology, but I'm interested in climate. the route that I've taken really is to start off as a basic scientist looking at cognitive psychology, looking at how people make decisions, how they learn, their memory, their judgment, but then thinking about how that applies to environmental issues and climate in particular. So how does the way we fundamentally deal with uncertainty or make risky choices play out when we're talking about that in an environmental or climate context? So I've worked on a variety of topics in that area. But the thing that I just wanted to highlight a little bit here is a course that I've been running for the last 4 or 5 years now, which is a capstone course in third year in psychology. So it's the course that all students in psychology have to take before they graduate. And it's about research and applications of psychological science. And the idea of it is that people get to the end of their course and think about how can I use that knowledge to build, as I leave university, to apply it to these broader societal issues. And when I was designing the course, I thought, well, a good way to do that is to connect topics in psychological science with the SDGs and see which ones apply where and how and try and build on that. So we all know, because they're posted up around the room here, these are our 17 goals. You can also look at, this is actually the way I start the course, the way I started the course this year with the opening lecture, is we've got all these goals, we're trying to achieve them, we're not making a fantastic progress on a lot of them. This is just the progress report for Australia, and you can see that we're maybe just above the 50% in terms of achieved or on track, so there's a lot of room for improvement. So then when you're thinking about how you might integrate psychological science into it, this is a graphic which actually comes from the UNSW SDG Moodle toolkit. I don't know if people are aware of that, but if you're not, you should check it out. It's really, really useful. It maps all of the different SDGs together, and this is an interactive map. I didn't bring the interactive bit, but you can click on it and see how everything joins up and how the targets are moving. And then in the course, what we try and do is get students to think about, okay, well, how can we take some of these SDGs and think about how they apply to psychological questions. So, for example, good health and well-being, SDG 3, you might think about that in terms of vaccination uptake. Right? There's lots of very interesting behavioural science on how to get people to take vaccines, how to combat some of the misinformation around vaccines. Or we might think about responsible consumption. We might think about theories of self-control to help us consume responsibly. Or we might go to climate action and think about how we combat misinformation, and so on and so forth. And we have lectures that are linked to each of these topics, and then the students design a project that addresses 1 or 2 or 3 of these goals by having an intervention that's informed by psychological science. And the feedback on this course has been pretty good. Here are some quotes from some of the students that have done the course before. And I think, what you get here is people saying things like inclusion of such engaging topics evidently directly impacting the world and wider society. It's so interesting to see how psychological science impacts the world. So it's, I think, broadening the horizons from the topics that they've maybe done in detail, which is super important to get an understanding of the discipline, and then to think, okay, now how do I apply that to wider society? Okay. I'm going to jump now to introducing our panelists. And the way that I put this panel together was to ask people who had been recipients of the seed funding grants that the Institute's been giving out over the last couple of years, because I think that provides a nice segue into how do we advance these projects more broadly across the university. What is the role of an institute like ICRR in bringing people together and developing their research? And so the first person I want to bring up onto the stage is Ayse Arik, who is in the School of Risk and Actuarial Sciences here at UNSW. Come and have a seat, Ayse. She's a lecturer in the school, and she was a recipient just earlier this year of a grant that's going to look at the links between climate and early onset cancer. So Ayse is an actuary, and she'll explain what that is for people that don't know what that is. Later. But this is a project that's really just started, so I'm very excited to see where it goes. And then next up, I wanted to introduce Maria Nawaz, who is part of the Australian Climate Accountability Project, jointly with the Australian Human Rights Institute. And Maria is a human rights lawyer and is now involved directly in this project where we're trying to link climate science and the attribution of climate science to the impact of fossil fuel projects so as to keep these kinds of companies accountable for what they're doing. And then last but not least, the project there, Financial Stability in Australia, Insights from Climate Stress Testing. I've realised I've jumped that slide, but that's fine. Is Kristle Romero Cortes, who is Associate Professor in the School of Banking and Finance here in the Business School. And off the back of a seed funding grant that ICRR gave a couple of years ago, Kristle's now launched this UNSW Rise Finance hub, which is looking at sustainable and ethical finance. So that's how the panel's been put together, and now we will turn to a discussion with them about what they're doing and how it links to ICRR and the UN SDGs. So I'm going to have a seat, and then we'll have some time for questions if there are questions at the end. So I'd like to start, maybe I'll start at the far end with you, Kristle. Your project, I guess, has gone from an idea, a seed fund, to getting industry funding associated with it, and now launching this RISE lab as part of within the business schools. Can you tell us a bit about that process and how it works and what you're wanting to now do with it?
Absolutely. So I think what I'd like to highlight and start is just thank you to Ben and to the Institute for Climate Risk and Response, because I feel in a way he's almost undersold it in terms of how we can do this interdisciplinary and connective work where we can collaborate, but in a strategic way. It is not the first time people have tried, but I feel like it's one of the first time people have been successful. So it's a testament to Ben and to our other directors in the Institute for Climate Risk and Response, both in the business school with David Grant and the Faculty of Law and Justice with Cameron. But the reality is I'm an academic, tried and true. I have spent time at a regulator in the US. I was at the Fed, and now I'm teaching and I'm doing my research, but all the while making sure that my research was going to have what I would call potentially a policy implication, for example. I'm sure a lot of you have now also heard with the Progress for All themes, we kind of interpret it as societal impact. And the reality is, what we do, especially in finance, is not something that gets unpacked in a way that then becomes really easy for people to appreciate or understand or put to use daily. And I think that's an absolute shame, because what we're doing is providing tools in order to make better choices, potentially financial decisions, but just behavioral choices. And what happened specifically with this project was looking at a way that we can identify patterns in temperature anomalies. So when high temperatures are happening more and more, there's actually understandable data. The data is fantastic when it comes to temperature. We've been doing a really good job at measuring it across the globe for a long time. And so within finance, we do have the idea we study money, but we also have an appreciation for the specific tools that we can use to kind of understand the whys and the wheres behind some of the mechanisms that move the capital markets, that move people being able to invest, banks making decisions, whether or not you're going to take a mortgage out, et cetera. So what we did, and this is a joint project with my co-author, Mandeep Singh, who's at the University of Sydney, was we looked at these patterns across temperature anomalies, and we attributed then to stock price fluctuations for publicly listed banks, because my feedback was actually more about the banking realm. Right? And so I studied banks or capital allocation from lenders, and what we could do using a lot of what's literally won Nobel Prizes in the past in finance, to apply this to a very specific opportunity to be able to teach, if the banks wanted the education, but also to create a model to stress test the banks on climate. right? And so to be able to provide them with some understanding what their portfolio looks like and how that actually translates into what the public views in terms of their stock prices. It's true because finance is money. We think a lot about the stock price, or you think about ways that make money. But the reality is there is an ethical side to finance as well. And this is what translated a little bit into our recent launch of our lab, our research. So it's a responsible, impactful, sustainable, and ethical lab that looks at ways that we're doing this research to promote the understanding of how all this decision-making actually is doing well and doing good, right? Because the reality is that's what I have seen. Right? I've been in industry, I've been in a regulator, I've been in academia. I've seen lots of opportunities for finance to be able to showcase, some of these tools. I've also seen maybe where finance has failed to help the people that it should have served. And finance is actually quite powerful. So if you're able to shift the capital into areas of need, you're going to be able to move the dial. And you have a lot of participants right now, because of the interest in making the world a better place, you're actually going to attract a lot of capital right now to climate. And what we're trying to make sure is that it is a race to the top as opposed to a possible race to the bottom. And that's what attracted the industry funding that we have for a superannuation fund from Australian Ethical, who invest in green bonds. And they actually wanted, they were going to do the investment anyways, but they wanted to know what is the best way? What is the literature saying about this? What's the evidence say about what they do? And sometimes we forget that what we do in the university daily is not average fare, right? People do things here that's absolutely fantastic, that it's important that we educate in a way to make sure it seems accessible. And so we've done a report, for example, that we'll be showcasing that soon. We have back-to-back half-day symposiums, and very exciting to report that every superannuation company we've invited so far have accepted. So I think there's a lot of desire to do good. We just want to be able to do that platform. And it really does come from seeing it in action and feeling, if I may use the word safe, to have that place carved out for us so that we can do the best things that we know how to do. But sometimes trial and error. I think mistakes are okay and we can learn from them. And then what we can do is, kind of push it forward. But it's absolutely a pleasure to be part of the ride. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Kristle. So just speaking there of attracting capital towards climate and shifting maybe capital away from, shall we say, more emissions-intensive activities, I think that brings us to the project that you've been involved with, Maria. And I did skip over the slide that had a little bit of info about this, and I did say to Maria, I'm not going to make her explain the diagram on this slide, but this is a picture of Maria and Wes Morgan, who's also involved in this work at our industry forum last week. And this diagram here is extracted excerpted from a paper that just came out a couple of weeks ago, which is, I think, arguably a product of this interaction between ICRR and AHRI, the Human Rights Institute, who have a stall downstairs. Because it's linking the attribution science, so how do we go from a particular event or aspect in the world, in this case a fossil fuel project, and attribute that to a direct change in the climate, and then what does that mean, the implications of that for fossil fuel companies, for example.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'd also like to start by thanking ICRR for their thought leadership in this space. So I recently joined the Australian Climate Accountability Project at the Australian Human Rights Institute, and our seed funding was initially from ICRR. And what that meant was that we actually had the resources to do the interdisciplinary work that industry so sorely needs in terms of establishing developments in the attribution science to address the causal link between fossil fuel emissions and what they actually mean for human and ecological impacts in a way that has never been done before. So I don't think I'm overstating it to say that the research that was recently published a few weeks ago, co-authored by climate scientists and members of the Australian Climate Accountability Project, is groundbreaking research, and it represents a huge development in the attribution science. So classical attribution science could look at emissions, for example. It could look at increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events. But this represents a huge development in attribution science where emissions have been quantified. This can be applied to any emission set, whether it be the emissions of a particular fossil fuel project or a state's emissions, or the emissions of a number of states, for example. And the novel approach in this methodology is it can now be linked to specific harms. So the scientists in this research took Woodside Scarborough project, which is a fossil fuel project, looked at the entire life cycle projected emissions of that project, and then quantified harms that would result from those emissions. So that's really significant because we know in Australia there's a push to decarbonise domestically. We know that our fossil fuel exports, including from research that has been done from the project, form the bulk of our contributions to emissions. So our research with climate analytics found that if you count our exports, Australia is the second highest contributor in the world to fossil fuel emissions, just behind Russia. So that's really significant. So we can now quantify these emissions, but what does it mean for the human and ecological harms? And the Nature Climate Action piece showed Woodside's project was likely to have emissions over its life cycle that would contribute to 0.000039 degrees of global warming. And that might sound like a tiny number, but it's actually really significant when the scientists linked it to what this means in terms of those human and ecological harms. And the scientists found, using this new methodology, that it would push 350,000 people outside of the human climate niche where it's comfortable to work and live in. They found that this project would cause 16 million coral deaths in each bleaching event in the Great Barrier Reef, so that's a huge number. They also found that the project would cause 486 heat-related deaths in Europe alone, so not globally, but they had a data set in relation to Europe. And that's really significant because I think when you start talking about the number of deaths created by a fossil fuel project, that changes the conversation. And what this research essentially does is effectively provides a rigorous science-based methodology for quantifying harms caused by emissions and directly counters what we often see in the project approval process and environmental impact statements that are put forward by fossil fuel companies, for example. So with the Woodside Scarborough project, Woodside submitted its environmental impact statement and they said the social impacts and the environmental impacts of the Scarborough project are negligible. So nothing's really going to happen. It's a drop in the ocean is the argument often used. But now we've got this methodology which shows actually no, these are the quantifiable harms that are going to be caused by this project. So I think it really does shift the conversation. And what it also is very useful for is providing further accountability, either through policy to get it before decision makers or for climate litigators to use this new methodology to say, well, actually, we're in court now. we are directly countering your evidence as to the harms of this project, and we can now, with this new methodology, with a greater confidence, quantify the harms and demonstrate a causal link between the emissions being talked about in court and the harms they've caused. And that's been a major challenge in litigation in Australia for many years, establishing that causation or causal link. So it's definitely groundbreaking research, and I think it shows the huge power of interdisciplinary research being supported by ICRR and the university, because everyone I've ever worked with in climate litigation, so I previously worked as a human rights lawyer in climate litigation and other forms of litigation, I've never seen my email go off like it did when this article came out. So people are really interested in the research, and people are really interested in figuring out how to use it in industry in their day-to-day work. And I think that's what we're here for, aiming to do research that directly contributes to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And this research, I think, really speaks towards both climate action and, efforts to mitigate our emissions, and also justice and establishing strong institutions and strong accountability either through the courts or through pressure on corporate disclosure to ensure that tools that are available are used to avoid greenwashing and other such things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think the workshop that we ran with Human Rights Institute earlier in the year, where Neroli Abrams, who's the lead author on this work, who's now the chief Antarctic scientist, I think. She was at ANU before that. She came and presented, and it was, mind-blowing to me that the arguments that had been made in kind of Woodside submissions, or indeed the failure to get through the courts, was because they were basically saying things like, look, you can't tell where each molecule of water is in this glass, so therefore those molecules don't contribute to the height of water in this glass, right? Which just seems totally bonkers when you do that. But that's basically what they're saying. You can't identify the little bit of carbon dioxide that we're emitting from this project, and therefore it's not contributing to global warming, which on its face is utterly false. And so seeing that, and then he was saying to me the other day that once some of the law firms that had been at that presentation were then saying, when's this thing coming out? When's this paper coming out? Which is not typically the reaction that academics get, right? It's like, oh, do you want to read my paper? No. So it really is a success story. Ayse, you're at the other end of this process. So you got a seed fund grant earlier this year from ICRR. So it's very much in the building up planning stages. Can you tell us a bit about what you're hoping to do with your seed fund?
Well, thank you. It is really fascinating to be here and then listening to all these success stories. It's really amazing. So perhaps I can start by saying how I just reached you out.
Yeah. That
might be relevant. So I heard about the ICRR and how they are supporting different researchers from the colleagues at business school, basically. So we have a few number of participants and just doing research with you, and then they were really talking highly about the interdisciplinary research supported by the ICRR, and it just felt really intriguing and right to reach you out, because my research is, I understand, a bit unusual. I'm an actuary, I'm a health and life insurance actuary, but a significant part of my research is actually on cancer risk, and the way how I just did the research is to understand health inequalities and cancer inequalities within the framework of longevity risk. When I was just hearing about the experience of the colleagues, I thought perhaps this is the right place to start establishing a good interdisciplinary group and then talk about my ideas. And that was really the right decision, because we are now in the process of building up a strong interdisciplinary group of researchers and to just apply for a larger scale of funding along the way. My current research, supported by the ICRR, is in the nexus of cancer and climate risk, with a particular focus on early onset cancers, because there is this increasing and somewhat worrying surge in early onset cancers. Given my earlier literature review and modeling experience with cancer risk, we already know that there are socioeconomic inequalities and regional variations in cancer morbidity and mortality. And we translated this into insurance type figures, like in terms of cancer insurance pricing and reserving. Now, what we wanted to see to understand if there's any relevance of climate risk factors that can be brought to the picture and helping us explain what is happening there. So climate risk and cancer is under-researched, and now basically the researchers, oncologists, people doing research on cancer, we don't know why the surge in early onset cancers is happening. So perhaps there is a side coming from environmental exposures linked to climate risk factors such as this extreme heat, air pollution, water pollution. There are some empirical evidence in the literature, but it is controversial depending on the size of the population and clinical trials. So what we are trying to do is to understand, can we first find an empirical relevance on the general population level, and how we can just model this, translate this into certain figures that can reach out insurers, governments, so that they can just come up with more sustainable solutions. So in essence, the project we are just doing with the ICRR is just fitting naturally in the sustainable development goals, such as good health and well-being, and reducing inequalities and climate change itself. And what I also think is, like, we as actuaries, we have quite a good way of looking at numbers. So we have a particular way of thinking and developing models and looking at long-term risks and quantifying future predictions under different scenarios. And perhaps this is exactly what is needed here to understand the impact of climate change on health nexus. And we can just bring this in. And I hope with this project we can just reach a successful outcome. So because we are developing a research project, we'll be reaching out industry partners. We are naturally successful with this, but we want something more ambitious. We want to bring different partners like public health, the institute itself, and we as business school, we can just bring a significant amount of funding together to bring good researchers together and then perhaps come up with a really useful solution at the end for everyone.
Yeah, and what excites me about this particular project is that it is something that requires people with different skill sets, different knowledge, but also different knowledge of the data, the raw data sets that are out there that are going to enable you to answer those kinds of questions. And then the potential impact of that and what that then means for not just understanding the link between, the potential link between climate and early onset cancer, but then what that means for treatment, what that means for policy recommendations for health service, how you roll those things out. It's all very much intertwined, and I think it does provide, again, our ICRR-based faculties are science, law and justice and business, but this is clearly bringing in, we've been talking to colleagues in public health and medicine and implementation science, and it broadens that whole story out.
And I'm really grateful for this because now normally we don't have much chances while developing big research projects and go for funding. But now with this seed funding, it is possible to just to take the first initial step, like mapping the data sets to see what is really available in the literature and consider developing methods and make it more concrete, solid. Just this really increases the chances of a successful outcome as well.
I'm going to, we've got about 12 minutes according to this thing, and I'll open it up for questions if there are some in a minute. But I just wanted to go back to you, Kristle. So in my little presentation, I talked about the third-year course that I run, and it's been an interesting experience because at the start of that, and in fact, a couple of my students, they were here, I don't know if they're still here, in teaching that, some of the undergrads, you know, some of them have heard of the SDGs, some of them have no idea what they are or any. Mm-hmm. But through, you know, integrating that with the material, they start to learn and start to find out a bit more about that, and I think that that's a good thing. You were telling me the other day that you just won an award at the Business Insights Institute. Is that for a course that you have that also brings in SDGs? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Absolutely. So the business school, the education showcase, had an SDG kind of theme and ways that we as faculty, obviously our main goal here is to educate, and ways that we embed the SDGs into our courses. And look, it's kind of interesting because I teach real estate finance. Right, so again, you've heard me say I talk about climate risk, I talk about banks, and all of a sudden I'm teaching real estate. But in Australia, our largest asset class to our banks is their mortgage lending. And the reality is in Australia, the residential real estate market is 4 times that of the ASX. Okay, so we have a lot of money that's tied up in finance, in real estate. And what I assign my students to do is to go buy a house. And I tell them don't actually buy a house, or if they do, it's not on me. And then I also switched it, and I assigned them the way to be like an institutional investor, as if they're inside of a real estate institutional trust or real estate investor manager. And what I then say, part of that, is flip it again to ask them how much they have maybe thought about or considered or used the UN SDGs in the actual decision-making process. And even if you take something like, you know, end world hunger, right? At first you're thinking, oh, that's really far. But you step it back and you start to talk about where people decide to live, you know, over abundance in certain area. You can move to different ways that we're dealing with transport in order to get to our homes because of what the amenities that we want. And honestly, we vote with our feet, right? And the reality is it starts to shift their frame point of, can I afford this house? Do I want this house, right? And so I think that that's an important thing because first, obviously showing them that they can do this, that they're empowered to make these decisions helps, because a lot of what especially even third-year students, they're nearing their graduation and they're deciding what type of careers they're going into. And look, there's a lot of iBankers and there's a lot of, you know, very keen, ambitious students, which I don't begrudge them anything, but there's a reality of what are they going to do with all of that is coming their way? And they don't have to just accept it on the face front. And so when I give them that social license, I think it's helpful because then it reminds them that they're allowed to do this in their real life. And that's what is the translation of that. And I think that's what resonated with the audience. So I got the People Choice Award. Yeah.
Congratulations.
But, thanks.
Very good. Are there any questions from the audience for any of the panelists? Don't be shy. I think we have a microphone because it is being recorded. Yeah.
Can it be a question for you?
It can be a question for anyone.
Hi, Ben. Nice to see you again.
Likewise.
I'm wondering, how do you go about, you might be able to predict the question for me, how do you go about sort of aggregating the impact that your institute has, given the cross-disciplinary nature, given that you work across engagement, research, education, and also, I guess, distinguishing between kind of the impact you've realised and then a lot of what we're talking about here is impact and sort of potential for more impact as well? How does your institute tackle that?
It's a very good question. I'm looking at Elva, who's our news and content coordinator, who's sitting in the front here. I mean, she's done an incredible, I didn't put the slide in, but she's done an incredible job of driving our media impact recently. And I think, to go to the heart of what does it mean to have impact, in a traditional sense, it's getting lots of research dollars, right, and getting lots of money. But I think what we've been trying to do with the Institute beyond that is to have social impact, or impact in the sense that you can demonstrate that you've made a difference in the community. You've maybe been asked by government to represent or to educate or to be involved. So we've been doing a lot of work with New South Wales state government recently on basically upskilling them to do their climate mandatory reporting. We've also been working with the Net Zero Commission, applying some of the work on economic impacts to look at how they're going to try and achieve their targets for that. So it's that sort of recognition that I think quantifies as impact. And then obviously getting stories up, getting more and more engagement from the broader media into what you're doing is another way of demonstrating impact. Again, it's imperfect because we know that people can be viewing things not for good reasons and not all necessarily as a positive. But I think over time you start to get a sense of what that's doing. And in terms of where to go next with it, I think that there's, again, we're at the stage of trying to develop the next stage of the Institute. We were funded as a priority initiative, but for a finite period. And so we're now at that point of, okay, well, this is what we've achieved. This is the momentum we've got to at this point. Now we want to take it to the next level. And whether that means expanding and involving more faculties, or whether it means focusing in on the kind of model that we have at the moment, I think is working, and really bedding that down and thinking about how to do that better, rather than necessarily, to go to your point, do you need the massive house when you can do things well at a particular scale? So all of those indicators, I guess. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for this very, very interesting panel. I'm very interested in the intersection of psychology and climate change, and what I took from all of your perspectives was that, there's a lot of subconscious aspects that underlie all of the matters that you were talking about. And something that is also moving me a little bit in my approach or my research is that on the one hand, if we really think deeply about topics, we can find very, very good solutions, and we can, find complex insights. And then at the same time, I feel like when we look, as you said, a little bit outside the ivory tower, we have this tendency of people being more and more, let's say, fast thinking, not going very deeply into topics. I'm thinking of heuristics right now, or like how cognitive mechanisms work. And this is something that I struggle with. For example, if I talk to people completely outside my bubble and just I mention something like green funds, or I mention something like climate change, and there's directly a heuristic happening or an association happening of being like, she's from this like woke bubble. And I could imagine that this would be maybe something that you are also tackling, right, in your research and in your institute, of like kind of trying to bring human behavior and climate change together. So I would be really, really interested in what your take is on that.
I would say absolutely. We encounter that daily. I think you have something to remember, and I think press is extremely important, that sometimes now, I would have shied away from it. I was like, do I have the right answer? Am I the subject matter expert? And now I've just realized, no, because who are they going to go to next? Exactly. Right? So let me be the voice that makes them think or makes them stop. But the reality is, I have a hopeful message for that, is that I've been here now 8 years, and it was a hard slog, but there's a sense of, I feel like we've made some inroads, and maybe we're, preaching to the choir, the people that are a bit aware of this, but there's also a lot of good work to do there. And I am so appreciative to Ben and the behavioral experts in this field, because it opened up my eyes, even with something like slightly different from climate, looking at financial literacy. And I think of this as it's easy. Why don't we do this? And the reality is because it's humans and their desire to take on responsibility, right? I mean, we could teach it, but is it going to translate to something? And I think we start with the people that appreciate that. And then to everyone else, you do just stay on message and on point, because I think there is a awakening in a way that's coming back to your woke combination. But it's true that it takes time for people that have very different understanding, and there's a lot right now that provides that misinformation or disinformation. There was even a seminar that we've attended at the ICRR that look at that. But like, never stop doing the good deeds, because you're gonna find the industry partner, or you're gonna find the people that really genuinely understand it, and it will just explode. It will be like, that was there all along, yeah.
I'm a human rights lawyer who used to work in the community law sector and not-for-profit sector and in climate litigation against fossil fuel companies and government. So yes, I'm very used to this woke label. And interestingly for me, moving from that part of industry into UNSW again, I found that there is so much credibility and respect for both the Australian Human Rights Institute and ICRR, and it gives our research a bit of a shield from those sorts of attacks. I mean, I did see that the Australian did have an attack piece on this article when it came out, but I think sometimes when that happens, you think, oh, well, we're having an impact. You know, if people are attacking the work, they're engaging with the work, and you know, I think it probably drove interest in the research. And the other thing I'd say is, you know, I actually have no qualms if we're labelled as woke. What we're doing is essentially focusing on our legal international human rights law obligations that Australia has signed up to, and encouraging accountability in our democracy using our institutions that exist for that very purpose. And I think it's a beautiful thing to live in a democracy with the rule of law. So, yeah, I don't really find that to be a strong criticism or something that would concern me about doing this work.
Perhaps I can just bring a bit of insurance, reinsurance perspective. So this is my first year at UNSW in Australia, and before coming here, I had an opportunity to work in the UK, Turkey, and the US for a bit. So in my field, people were just more purist, but in the last 5 years, I see there is a clear transition from just, you know, all this purist approach to more interdisciplinary approach. Now people acknowledge the value of interdisciplinary work more and more. And this also shows with the citations, with our partnership with insurance and reinsurance companies as well. Now we work with people understanding the impact of different perceptions on insurance prices and how people behave, how they just say, for example, purchase a product and then decide not to use it or not to buy the right product, and the behavioral changes along the way, especially after the COVID. So now people, industry partners and academics as well, they just understand this. We use this in our modeling. It's not my expertise, but there is a growing literature in our field as well, and industry partners are definitely well aware and acknowledging this more and more.
And just to close on, really, because we've run out of time, but I think it is important not to think that people are, you know, irrational or unconsciously biased or, you know, just not engaged. I think, yes, there's an engagement part to it, but there's also often people have a different set of motivations, a different set of understanding of what the issue is that's being faced by them. And I think the role is really to try and meet them where they're at in that process and talk to them in the terms that the kind of incentives or the structures or the ways that they think about it, and not be dismissive and say, well, you guys are stupid because you're not listening to me. I think that's how to get that cut through, and that's why I do think having that behavioural lens is really important. Okay, this thing's flashing red at me in 000, so I think that means we're out of time. So thank you very much to my panellists, Kristle, Maria and Ayse, for that discussion, and thank you guys for coming along to listen. Thanks.